They say that sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones we love the deepest. But what they don't tell you is that on the day your own child breaks your heart so completely that you question everything you ever believed about love, about family, about yourself, that is when you discover what you were truly made of. My name is Evangeline Rosemary, and I am about to share with you the most painful 24 hours of my 67 years on this earth. A story that begins with the cruelest words ever spoken to me by my own son, and ends with something so unexpected that it stopped our entire town of Millbrook, Kentucky in its tracks. You see, I thought I knew what heartbreak was when I buried my dear husband Harold 10 years ago. I thought I understood suffering when I worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table and send my boy to college. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened on my 67th birthday. The day my son looked me straight in the eye and told me I was nothing but a burden. The day he threw me out of my own home like I was some stranger off the street. But here's the thing about rock bottom. Sometimes it is the only place where you can find the strength to do the impossible. I'm going to tell you about forgiveness. Not the easy kind you read about in greeting cards, but the kind that feels like swallowing glass. The kind that makes you question your own sanity. And most importantly, the kind that can transform not just your own heart, but the heart of the person who wounded you so deeply that you thought you might never recover. But before I get to that miracle, before I tell you about the phone call that changed everything, before I share how an entire community watched in amazement as God worked in ways none of us could have imagined, I need you to understand who I was before that terrible day. Because you cannot appreciate the light without understanding just how dark things got. My story begins in a little white house on Maple Street in Millbrook, Kentucky. Now, Millbrook isn't much to look at if you were passing through on the highway. Population 3,012, 1 main street, 2 churches, and a diner that has been serving the same meatloaf recipe since 1952. But to me, it has been home for 43 years. It is where I raised my son Thaddeus after his daddy died in that construction accident back in 2014. And if you're watching this right now, wherever you are in this world, I want you to know that your story matters too. Please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, leave a comment telling us where you were watching from, and share your thoughts. Your engagement helps us reach more people who might need to hear these words of hope. Now let me continue with my story. The house on Maple Street isn't too fancy. Harold bought it for us back in 1981 when Thaddeus was just 3 years old. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that has seen more family dinners than I can count, and a front porch where I've spent countless evenings watching the sunset and talking to the Lord. The wallpaper in the living room is faded now, and the hardwood floors creak in all the familiar places, but every inch of that house holds a memory. Thaddeus took his first steps across that living room floor. He learned to ride his bicycle in the driveway. When he was 8 years old, he carved his initials into the old oak tree in the backyard, and I pretended to be angry, but secretly loved seeing his little mark on something that would outlast us all. After Harold passed, that house became even more precious to me. It was the only thing I had left of our life together. The kitchen still smells like his coffee every morning. His tools are still hanging in the garage, waiting for projects that will never be finished. And in the bedroom we shared for 33 years, I still sleep on my side of the bed, leaving his side untouched, as if he might come home any day now and slip under those covers beside me. But more than being a shrine to Harold, that house was my gift to Thaddeus. You see, when Harold died, he left us with nothing but love and memories. No life insurance, no savings account, no college fund. Just a mortgage that still had 15 years left on it, and a son who was smart enough to make something of himself if he had the chance. So I did what any mother would do. I worked. Lord, how I worked. Monday through Friday, I cleaned offices downtown from 5 in the morning until 9. Then I'd come home, have a cup of coffee, and head to Mrs. Peterson E.'s house, where I'd spend the afternoon doing alterations and mending clothes. Evenings, I worked at the diner, serving coffee and pie to the night shift workers from the plant outside town. Saturdays, I cleaned houses for the wealthier families on the hill. Sundays were for church and catching up on the housework I'd neglected during the week. I want to lie to you and say it was easy. There were nights when I'd collapse into bed so tired that I couldn't even say my prayers properly. There were mornings when I'd wake up and wonder if I had the strength to do it all again. But every time I looked at Thaddeus, every time I helped him with his homework or watched him excel in school, I found the energy to keep going. That boy was my purpose, my reason for pushing through the exhaustion and the loneliness. And push I did. For 6 years, I worked those 3 jobs, saving every penny I could. I bought my clothes at thrift stores and learned to make $1 stretch further than it had any right to go. I ate peanut butter sandwiches for lunch so Thaddeus could have money for school supplies. I walked to work in the rain to save on gas so he could take his girlfriend to the movies. And when graduation day came, when I watched my son walk across that stage to receive his diploma, I knew every sacrifice had been worth it. Thaddeus was different from the other kids in Millbrook. He was ambitious in a way that both thrilled and worried me. While his classmates were content to work at the plant or maybe take over their family businesses, Thaddeus had bigger dreams. He wanted to study business in Louisville, maybe even start his own company someday. He was always talking about making money, about becoming successful, about leaving Millbrook behind for something bigger and better. I supported those dreams, even when they took him further and further away from me. When he got that scholarship to the University of Louisville, I was the proudest mother in Kentucky. When he graduated with honors and got his first job at a marketing firm, I bragged about him to anyone who would listen. And when he started his own consulting business 3 years later, I knew that all those years of struggle had led to this moment. But success has a way of changing people. And as Thaddeus' business grew, I began to notice changes in my son that broke my heart little by little. The warm, grateful boy who used to call me every Sunday became a busy man who barely had time for a text message. The son who used to visit every few weeks became someone I saw maybe 3 times a year. And the young man who used to hug me tight and tell me he loved me became someone who seemed almost embarrassed by his humble beginnings. Don't get me wrong, I was still proud of him. When he bought that big house in Louisville, when he started wearing those expensive suits, when he told me about his important clients and his growing bank account, I celebrated every success. But there was a distance between us now that I couldn't bridge no matter how hard I tried. Phone calls became shorter and less frequent. Visits became more rushed and formal. And slowly, painfully, I began to realize that the son I had sacrificed everything for was slipping away from me. The worst part wasn't the distance, though. It was the way he looked at me when he did come home, like I was a reminder of something he wanted to forget. Like the little house on Maple Street and the simple life we shared were somehow embarrassing to him now. He'd glance around the living room with those expensive clothes and that fancy watch, and I could see him calculating the distance between where he'd come from and where he was going. And that distance felt like a canyon that kept getting wider every year. Still, I held on to hope. I told myself that this was just a phase, that success was overwhelming him, that once he settled into his new life, he'd remember how much his old mother loved him. I convinced myself that blood was thicker than money, that the bond between a mother and child couldn't be broken by something as shallow as social status. I was wrong about a lot of things, but I was especially wrong about that. The changes in Thaddeus weren't just about success, though. They were about shame. Somehow, somewhere along the way, he'd begun to see his past as something to be hidden rather than celebrated. The story of his hard-working mother who sacrificed everything for his education became an embarrassment rather than a source of pride. The house where he'd been loved and nurtured became a symbol of everything he wanted to leave behind. And me? I became the living, breathing reminder of a life he no longer wanted to claim. I first noticed it during his last visit before my birthday. It was back in March, and he had come to tell me about some big business deal he was working on. He was excited, talking fast about investors and market shares and profit margins. I was trying to follow along, asking questions and showing interest when I offered to make him his favorite meal. You know what he said to me? He said, "Mom, I don't eat that kind of food anymore. I have a nutritionist now." That might sound like a small thing, but it felt like he was rejecting more than just my cooking. He was rejecting the part of himself that had been shaped by simple meals around our kitchen table. He was rejecting the mother who had learned to make miracles out of hamburger meat and love. But I kept trying. I kept believing that underneath all that success and sophistication, my little boy was still there. I kept believing that if I just loved him enough, if I just gave him enough space to grow, he'd find his way back to me. I kept believing that family meant something more than convenience, that love was stronger than embarrassment, that the sacrifices I'd made had built a foundation that couldn't be shaken. As my 67th birthday approached, I felt a familiar stirring of hope. Birthdays had always been special in our family. Even during the hardest years, we'd always found a way to celebrate. When Thaddeus was little and money was tight, we'd make a cake from a box mix and sing Happy Birthday by candlelight. When he was in college and couldn't afford to come home, we'd talk on the phone for hours while I ate a piece of store-bought cake and pretended it was a party. But this year felt different. This year, I was certain that God was going to use my birthday as a chance for reconciliation. I spent weeks planning, cleaning the house until it sparkled, buying ingredients for all of Thaddeus's childhood favorites. I even bought a new dress, the first one I'd purchased in 3 years. It was nothing fancy, just a simple blue dress with tiny flowers, but it made me feel pretty and hopeful. I decorated the house with flowers from my garden, set the table with the good china that had been Harold's mother Es, and prepared enough food to feed a small army. I wanted everything to be perfect. I wanted to show Thaddeus that home was still a place where he was loved unconditionally, where he could rest from the pressure of his important life and just be my son again. The morning of my birthday, I woke up before dawn and spent extra time in prayer. I thanked God for another year of life, for the gift of being Thaddeus's mother, and for the opportunity to heal whatever had gone wrong between us. I asked for wisdom in my words, for patience in my heart, and for the grace to love him exactly as he was, not as I wanted him to be. I spent the day cooking and humming hymns under my breath. I made his favorite pot roast, the one he'd requested for every birthday dinner from the time he was 5 until he left for college. I baked a chocolate cake from scratch, the same recipe my mother had taught me 50 years ago. I prepared green beans with bacon, mashed potatoes with real butter, and cornbread that was crispy on the outside and tender on the inside. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself checking the clock every few minutes. Thaddeus had said he'd be there by 6, and I wanted everything to be ready. I wanted the house to smell like love when he walked through the door. I wanted him to see how much thought and care had gone into every detail. I wanted him to remember what it felt like to be welcomed home. At 5:30, I changed into my new dress and checked my reflection in the mirror. I looked like what I was, a 67-year-old woman who'd worked hard all her life and was proud of it. My hands were rough from years of cleaning and sewing. My face was lined from worry and laughter, and my hair was more gray than brown now. But my eyes were bright with anticipation, and my heart was full of hope. By 6:15, I was standing at the front window, watching for his car. By 6:30, I was pacing the living room, telling myself that traffic was heavy or that he'd gotten held up at the office. By 7, I was fighting back tears and checking my phone for messages that never came. Finally, at 7:23, I heard a car in the driveway. My heart leaped with relief and joy as I rushed to the door, smoothing my dress and checking my hair one last time. This was it. This was the moment when everything would be all right again. But when I opened the door, the man standing on my porch wasn't the son I'd been hoping to see. Oh, it was Thaddeus, all right. But this version of him was harder somehow, more distant. He was wearing one of those expensive suits and carrying a briefcase, and he looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "Happy birthday, Mom," he said, but there was no warmth in his voice, no smile on his face, no hug waiting for me. "Thaddeus," I said, my voice bright with forced cheerfulness. "You were here. Come in, come in. I've made all your favorites." But he didn't move from the doorway. He just stood there, looking past me into the house like he was seeing it for the first time. And the expression on his face, it was like he was looking at something distasteful, something he wanted to get away from as quickly as possible. "Mom, we need to talk." Yes, those 4 words hit me like a physical blow. In all my years of motherhood, I'd learned that "we need to talk" never led anywhere good. But I forced myself to smile, to hope, to believe that maybe he just wanted to clear the air between us. "Of course, honey. Come sit down. Dinner is almost ready. We can talk while we eat." But Thaddeus shook his head. "I am not staying for dinner. I can... tea. I have things to do. On my birthday. My 67th birthday." The day I'd been planning for weeks. The day I'd poured my heart into preparing for. He couldn't stay for dinner because he had things to do. What things? I asked, and I hated how small my voice sounded. What could be more important than spending your mother's birthday with her? And that S when something shifted in his expression. Something cold and calculating and completely foreign to the boy I'd raised. He stepped into the house, but not like he was coming home, like he was entering enemy territory. That is exactly what I need to talk to you about, Mom. This has to stop. What has to stop? This guilt, this emotional manipulation, this constant pressure to be someone I am not anymore. I stared at him, not understanding. Thaddeus, I don't know what you mean. I am not pressuring you to be anyone. I just want to see my son. No, he said, and his voice was rising now. What you want is to keep me trapped in this place, in this life, in this version of myself that doesn't exist anymore. You want me to pretend that I am still that grateful little boy who thinks a pot roast dinner is the height of sophistication. His words were like knives, but I kept trying to understand. Honey, I know you've changed. I know you've accomplished amazing things. I am proud of you. I just want to be part of your life. Part of my life? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Mom, you are my life. You are the reason I can to move forward, the reason I can to fully embrace the success I've worked so hard for. Every time I try to entertain clients or attend important social events, I'm worried they'd all find out about my background, about this house, about you. The room started spinning. I reached for the back of a chair to steady myself. About me? Yes, about you. About how my mother cleans houses for a living and lives in a house that time forgot. About how I come from nothing and have to pretend I belong in the world I've built for myself. Each word was a hammer blow to my heart. This was my son, my baby, the child I'd given everything for. And he was telling me that I was something to be ashamed of, something to be hidden. Thaddeus, I whispered. I don't understand. I thought you were proud of how hard we worked. I thought you were grateful for the sacrifices we made. Grateful? His voice was incredulous now. Mom, 34 years old. I am a successful businessman. I have responsibilities, obligations, a reputation to maintain. I cannot keep being dragged down by guilt about your feelings or worry about your needs. Dragged down? The words came out as barely a whisper. Yes, dragged down. Every phone call is about how lonely you are. Every visit is about how much you miss me. Every conversation is designed to make me feel guilty for building a life that is bigger than this town, bigger than this house, bigger than the small dreams you had for me. I was crying now, and I couldn't stop. I never meant to make you feel guilty. I just love you. I just want to be part of your life. Well, you can TB. Not anymore. Not like this. And then he said the words that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The words that would replay in my mind during the darkest hours of the night. The words that would make me question everything I'd ever believed about love and family and the meaning of sacrifice. Mom, I need you to sell this house. I stared at him, certain I'd heard wrong. What? I need you to sell this house. I have some business ventures that require additional capital, and this property is my inheritance. I need you to sell it so I can use the money to expand my company. Thaddeus, this is my home. This is where your father and I built our life together. This is where I raised you. I cannot just sell it. Yes, you can, and you will. Because if you done it, I'll have to take legal action to force the sale. And trust me, Mom, you do not want that kind of public embarrassment. The world tilted on its axis. My own son was threatening me. My own child was trying to take away the only security I had left. Where would I live? I asked, my voice breaking. I don't know. That it's not my problem anymore. Maybe you can find a small apartment somewhere. Maybe you can move in with one of your church friends. Maybe you can figure out how to take care of yourself for once, instead of making it my responsibility. Your responsibility. I was sobbing now, great gulping sobs that shook my whole body. I never asked you to take care of me. I worked 3 jobs to take care of you. I sacrificed everything so you could have a better life. And that's exactly the problem, he said, his voice cold as winter. You sacrificed everything, and now you expect me to be grateful for the rest of my life. You expect me to carry the weight of your choices, to live with the guilt of your sacrifices, to pretend that I am still that poor kid who needed his mother to work herself to death just to survive. "I don't expect anything from you," I whispered. "I just love you." "No, you do not love me. You love the idea of me. You love the son who makes you feel needed and important and justified in all your suffering. But you do not love the man I've become. You do not love the success I've achieved. You do not love the life I've built." And then he delivered the final blow, the words that would echo in my heart for months to come. "You re a burden, Mom. You re a weight around my neck that I can't carry anymore. I am tired of pretending that this relationship works for both of us when it is only holding me back." The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there in my new dress, surrounded by the decorations I'd hung with such hope, breathing in the smell of the dinner I'd prepared with such love, and felt my heart break into 1,000 pieces. "Get out," I whispered. "What? Get out of my house. Get out now." "Mom, I am trying to help you understand." "Get out," I screamed, and the sound surprised both of us. "Get out of my house right now and don't to come back until you remember how to be my son." But Thaddeus stood there for a moment, looking shocked by my reaction. Then his expression hardened again. "Fine, but this conversation isn't over. You have 30 days to put this house on the market. After that, I'll have my lawyer contact you." He turned and walked out the door, leaving me standing in the ruins of my birthday celebration, surrounded by the ghost of every hope I'd ever had for our relationship. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the door he'd walked through, waiting for him to come back and tell me this was all a terrible mistake. But he didn't come back. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the mantel and the quiet bubbling of the pot roast that no one would ever eat. Finally, I sank into Harold's old chair and let the tears come. I cried for the little boy who used to run to me with skinned knees and broken hearts. I cried for the young man who used to call me his hero. I cried for the mother who had given everything and somehow lost everything in the process. But mostly, I cried because I had no idea how I was going to find a way to forgive the person who had just destroyed my world on what should have been one of the happiest days of my life. And as I sat there in that empty house, surrounded by the wreckage of my dreams, I had no way of knowing that in less than 24 hours, everything would change in a way that would test every ounce of faith I had left. The hours that followed Thaddeus' departure were the longest of my life. I sat in that chair until well past midnight, replaying every word he'd said, every cruel accusation, every moment when I could have responded differently. The pot roast grew cold on the stove. The birthday cake sat untouched on the counter. The flowers I'd arranged with such care seemed to mock me with their cheerful colors. Around 2 a.m, I finally forced myself to move. I walked through the house like a ghost, turning off lights, covering the food that no one would eat, blowing out the candles that had never been lit in celebration. Each task felt monumental, like I was moving through water, like the very air had become thick and heavy with grief. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Thaddeus' voice calling me a burden. Every time I tried to rest, I saw the coldness in his eyes, the way he'd looked at me like I was something distasteful that needed to be discarded. So I sat by my bedroom window, watching the darkness slowly give way to dawn, wondering how the son I'd loved so completely could have become a stranger who felt nothing but shame for the woman who'd given him life. When the sun finally rose on what should have been the day after my birthday celebration, I felt like I'd aged 10 years in one night. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a woman I barely recognized. My eyes were swollen from crying, my face was pale and drawn, and my new dress was wrinkled from sleeping in the chair. But it was more than physical exhaustion. Something fundamental had shifted inside me, something that made me question everything I'd ever believed about love and sacrifice and what it meant to be a mother. I tried to go through the motions of a normal day. I made coffee with hands that shook so badly I could barely hold the pot. I attempted to eat a piece of toast, but it tasted like cardboard in my mouth. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the place where Thaddeus should have been sitting, sharing birthday breakfast and making plans for the day ahead. When the phone rang. For one wild, hopeful moment, I thought it might be Thaddeus calling to apologize, to tell me he had been under stress and had said things he did not mean. I practically ran to the phone, my heart pounding with desperate hope. Hello? I said, trying to keep the eagerness out of my voice. Evangeline, honey, It is Cordelia. Cordelia Matthews had been my closest friend for over 20 years. We'd met at church when Thaddeus was still small, and she'd been my anchor through every storm life had thrown my way. She was a widow too, having lost her husband James about 5 years earlier, and she understood the particular loneliness that comes with raising children alone and growing old without the partner you'd planned to share your golden years with. "Cordelia," I said, and just hearing her familiar voice made the tears start again. "Oh, Cordelia. Sweetheart, what's wrong? You sound terrible." And so I told her. Sitting there in my kitchen, still wearing yesterday's dress, I poured out the whole story. I told her about the weeks of preparation, about the hope I'd carried, about Thaddeus' coldness and his demand that I sell the house. I told her about being called a burden by the child I'd sacrificed everything for, about the threat of legal action, about the way he looked at me like I was something to be ashamed of. Cordelia listened without interruption, making small sounds of sympathy and outrage at all the right moments. When I finally finished, both of us were crying. "That boy has lost his mind," she said fiercely. "After everything you did for him, after all the love you poured into his life, how dare he treat you this way?" "I don't know what I did wrong," I whispered. "I keep going over and over it in my mind, trying to figure out where I failed him." "You didn't fail him, Evangeline. You loved him. You gave him everything you had. If he cannot see the value in that, if he is so blinded by his own success that he has forgotten where he came from, that is not your fault." "But maybe he is right," I said, the words coming out in a rush. "Maybe I did hold him back. Maybe I did make him feel guilty for succeeding. Maybe I was so focused on being needed that I didn't know when to let go." "Stop that right now," Cordelia said sharply. "Don't you dare let that boy's cruelty make you question the beautiful way you raised him. You worked yourself to the bone to give him opportunities. You celebrated every achievement, supported every dream, and loved him unconditionally. If he chooses to see that as manipulation instead of sacrifice, that says everything about him and nothing about you." And we talked for another hour, with Cordelia listening to me cry and offering the kind of comfort that only comes from someone who truly knows your heart. When we finally hung up, she'd insisted that I pack a bag and come stay with her for a few days. "You shouldn't be alone right now," she said. "And you certainly shouldn't be sitting in that house, surrounded by reminders of yesterday's pain." Part of me wanted to refuse. This was my home, my sanctuary, the place where Harold and I had built our life together. Leaving felt like surrender, like admitting that Thaddeus had won. But another part of me, the part that felt bruised and broken and completely overwhelmed, knew that Cordelia was right. I couldn't bear to spend another night in that house, listening to the echoes of harsh words and shattered dreams. So I packed a small suitcase with enough clothes for a few days, gathered my Bible and the few personal items that brought me comfort, and drove the 6 blocks to Cordelia's house. She met me at the door with a hug that lasted long enough for me to fall apart all over again. And then she led me inside and settled me in her guest room like I was a wounded bird that needed shelter from the storm. Cordelia's house was smaller than mine, but it felt warm and safe in a way that my own home no longer did. She made me a cup of tea with honey, the way she always did when one of us was hurting, and we sat in her living room talking about everything and nothing until exhaustion finally claimed me. That first night at Cordelia's, I slept better than I had in months. Maybe it was the emotional exhaustion, or maybe it was the comfort of knowing that someone cared enough to take me in when I had nowhere else to go. But for the first time since Thaddeus's visit, I managed to sleep for more than a few minutes at a time. I woke up the next morning feeling slightly more human, though the weight of what had happened still pressed down on my chest like a physical thing. Cordelia had made breakfast, and we sat at her kitchen table eating scrambled eggs and talking about practical things. Where would I live if I had to sell the house? What kind of legal options did I have? Should I try to call Thaddeus and attempt some kind of reconciliation? It was during that conversation that Cordelia's phone rang. She answered it with her usual cheerful greeting, but her expression quickly changed to one of shock and concern. "What? When? Oh my Lord, are you sure?" I watched her face grow pale as she listened to whoever was on the other end of the line. My heart started beating faster, though I didn't yet know why. "Yes, Yes, I'll tell her right away. Thank you for calling." She hung up the phone and turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before. It was a mixture of shock, sadness, and something else I couldn't quite identify. "T. Evangeline," she said slowly. "That was Margaret from the prayer chain at church. Margaret Henderson ran our church's prayer chain, the network of women who called each other whenever someone in our community needed prayers for illness, loss, or crisis. If Margaret was calling, it meant something serious had happened. "What is it?" I asked, though part of me already dreaded the answer. Cordelia reached across the table and took my hands in hers. "Ah, honey, there's been an accident." The world seemed to tilt sideways. "What kind of accident?" "It's Thaddeus. He was driving back to Louisville last night after he left your house. There was an accident on Highway 65, just outside of Bardstown. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit him head on. I couldn't breathe. The room started spinning, and I felt like I was falling even though I was sitting down. Is he alive?" Cordelia said quickly. "But Evangeline, it is bad. He is in critical condition at University Hospital in Louisville. They don't know if he is going to make it." The irony wasn't lost on me, even in that moment of shock and terror. Less than 24 hours after my son had called me a burden and told me he never wanted to see me again, he was fighting for his life in a hospital bed. Less than a day after he'd walked out of my house with nothing but coldness and cruelty. He was dependent on machines to keep him breathing. "I have to go to him," I said, standing up so quickly that my chair nearly fell over. "I have to get to the hospital." "Of course you do," Cordelia said, already reaching for her car keys. "I'll drive you." As we hurried to get ready, my mind was racing with 1,000 different thoughts and emotions. Fear for Thaddeus, as life warred with the fresh pain of his rejection. Love for my child battled with the hurt he'd caused me. And underneath it all was a question that would haunt me for days to come. How do you pray for someone who has just broken your heart? How do you rush to the bedside of someone who has told you that you are nothing but a burden in their life? The drive to Louisville took just over an hour, but it felt like the longest hour of my life. Cordelia drove while I sat in the passenger seat, alternating between prayer and panic. I found myself bargaining with God, promising to be a better mother, to give Thaddeus more space, to somehow find a way to be less of a burden if only he would survive this. But even as I prayed for his recovery, I couldn't forget the look in his eyes when he'd told me to sell the house. I couldn't unhear the words he'd spoken about being ashamed of me. And I couldn't stop wondering if this was God's way of punishing him for the cruelty he'd shown to his mother. The thought horrified me as soon as it formed. What kind of mother wishes punishment on her child, even a child who has wounded her deeply? What kind of woman sees her son as suffering as divine justice instead of a tragedy to be prevented? And yet, there it was. Alongside my fear and love and desperate hope for his recovery was a small, dark voice that whispered, "Maybe now he'll understand. Maybe now he'll appreciate what he has. Maybe now he'll remember that family is more important than business deals and social status." I hated that voice. I hated the part of myself that could think such things about my own child, even for a moment. But it was there, ugly and honest and impossible to ignore. When we finally reached the hospital, I was shaking so badly that Cordelia had to help me out of the car. University Hospital was huge and intimidating, all glass and steel and the kind of modern efficiency that made me feel small and out of place. This was Thaddeus' world now, I realized. This was the kind of sleek, expensive environment where he felt comfortable, where he belonged. At the information desk, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a professional smile asked us who we were there to see. "Thaddeus Rosemary," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "He was in a car accident last night. I am his mother." She typed something into her computer and frowned slightly. "I am sorry, but Mr. Rosemary is in the intensive care unit, and visiting is restricted to immediate family only." "I am immediate family," I said, confused. "I'm his mother." The woman looked at her screen again, then back at me with an expression that was both sympathetic and apologetic. According to our records, Mr. Rosemary's emergency contact is listed as his business partner, not family members, and he has specifically requested that his medical information not be shared with anyone except authorized personnel." The words hit me like a physical blow. Even in his medical records, even in the paperwork that would matter if he died, Thaddeus had made sure to exclude me. He'd made sure that if something happened to him, I wouldn't even be notified. There must be some mistake, Cordelia said, stepping forward. This woman raised that boy. She's his only family. The receptionist looked genuinely sorry for us, but her hands were tied by policy and by Thaddeus' own wishes. I understand, and I am very sorry, but I can override the patient's explicit instructions. If you'd like to speak with someone about updating the emergency contact information, I can have a social worker meet with you. We stood there for several minutes, trying to figure out what to do next. Finally, Cordelia suggested that we call the business partner listed as Thaddeus E.S., emergency contact. Maybe he would be more reasonable, more willing to bend the rules for a mother's desperate need to see her injured son. It took 3 phone calls and nearly an hour of waiting, but eventually, a man named Derek Collins arrived at the hospital. He was about Thaddeus' age, wearing the same kind of expensive suit that my son favored, and he looked at us with the polite but distant expression of someone who had more important things to do. "You must be Thaddeus' mother," he said, extending his hand for a brief, perfunctory handshake. "I am Derek Collins, his business partner." "How is he?" I asked immediately. "Please, I just need to know how my son is doing." Derek's expression softened slightly, and for a moment he looked almost human. It's pretty bad, Mrs. Rosemary. He has multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and a severe head injury. The doctors aren't sure if he is going to wake up." The floor seemed to drop out from under me. Cordelia caught my arm to steady me as I processed what he'd just said. My son, my baby, might never wake up. He might die without ever knowing that despite everything he said to me, despite all the pain he caused, I still loved him with every fiber of my being. "Can I see him?" I whispered. "Please, I just need to see him." Derek looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Rosemary, I don't know if that is a good idea." Thaddeus was very clear about his wishes regarding family contact. He's been trying to establish some boundaries, and I don't think he'd want me to override those, even in these circumstances. Boundaries? The word came out sharper than I intended. "Mr. Collins, my son is lying in there fighting for his life. I don't care about boundaries. I care about being there for him when he needs me." "I understand your feelings," Derek said, his tone maddeningly calm and professional. "But as Thaddeus' business partner and the person he trusted to make decisions on his behalf, I have to respect his wishes. He's been working very hard to build independence from family obligations. Family obligations, that is what I was to him now. Not his mother, not the woman who I'd loved and sacrificed for him, but an obligation to be managed and eventually discarded." Cordelia stepped forward, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Young man, that woman worked 3 jobs to put your business partner through college. She sacrificed her health, her comfort, and her own dreams so that boy could have the opportunities that led to his success. And now you're telling her that she can even see him when he might be dying?" Derek had the grace to look ashamed, but he didn't change his position. "I am sorry. I really am. But Thaddeus specifically told me that if anything ever happened to him, I should handle all the arrangements and keep his personal life separate from his family situation. He said it was important to maintain those boundaries. And there it was again, that word, boundaries. As if love was something that needed to be controlled and contained. As if a mother's heart was a threat to be managed rather than a gift to be treasured. We argued for another 20 minutes, with me pleading and Derek remaining politely but firmly unmoved. Finally, Cordelia suggested that we find a chapel or waiting area where we could pray and figure out our next move. The hospital chapel was a small, non-denominational space with simple wooden pews and stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns on the floor. We sat in the back row, and for the first time since Cordelia's phone call that morning, I allowed myself to really feel the full weight of what was happening. My son was dying. The child I carried in my body, nursed at my breast, rocked to sleep through countless sleepless nights, was lying in a hospital bed fighting for his life. And because of his own choices, because of the walls he'd built between us, I couldn't even be there to hold his hand or whisper words of love and encouragement. But as I sat in that chapel, surrounded by the quiet peace that comes from being in a place dedicated to prayer and reflection, something shifted inside me. The anger and hurt were still there, but they were joined by something else, something that felt like grace. I thought about the Jesus I'd been taught to follow since I was a little girl. I thought about how he'd forgiven the people who crucified him, how he had shown mercy to those who showed him none. I thought about the countless sermons I'd heard about turning the other cheek, about loving your enemies, about the radical power of forgiveness. And I realized that if I was going to claim to be a Christian, if I was going to say that I followed the teachings of Christ, then I couldn't let my son's cruelty determine my response. I couldn't let his rejection poison my love, or his boundaries prevent me from being the mother he needed, even if he didn't want me to be. Cordelia, I said quietly, I need to find a way to forgive him. She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Forgive him? Evangeline, honey, your son just spent the last 24 hours treating you like garbage, and now his business partner wanted to even let you see him when he is dying. What is there to forgive? Everything, I said. And as I spoke the words, I felt a strange sense of peace beginning to settle over my heart. I need to forgive him for being ashamed of me. I need to forgive him for calling me a burden. I need to forgive him for trying to take away my home. And I need to forgive him for shutting me out when he needs love the most. But why? Cordelia asked, her voice gentle but confused. Why would you forgive someone who has hurt you so deeply? I thought about that question for a long moment, trying to find words for something that felt more like a calling than a choice. Because holding on to this anger is killing me. Because resentment is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. And because if he dies, I want the last emotion I felt for him to be love, not bitterness. We sat in silence for several minutes, both lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Cordelia reached over and squeezed my hand. How do you do that? She asked. How do you choose to forgive someone who has broken your heart? I don't know yet, I admitted, but I have to try. For his sake, for my sake, and because it is what my faith demands of me. And so, sitting in that hospital chapel while my son fought for his life just floors above us, I began the hardest spiritual work I'd ever attempted. I began the process of forgiving the person who had wounded me most deeply, even though he couldn't hear my forgiveness, even though he might never wake up to receive it. But little did I know that the real test of my faith was yet to come, and that the next few hours would challenge everything I thought I knew about love, forgiveness, and the mysterious ways that God works in our darkest moments. I spent the next 3 hours in that chapel, alternating between prayer and quiet conversation with Cordelia. She was struggling to understand my decision to forgive Thaddeus, and honestly, I was struggling to understand it myself. Every time I thought I'd found peace, another wave of hurt would wash over me. Every time I managed to feel genuine compassion for my son, the memory of his cruel words would surface and the anger would return. Forgiveness, I was learning, wasn't a single moment of decision. It was a choice I had to make over and over again, sometimes minute by minute. It was a battle between my wounded heart and my faithful spirit, and the faithful spirit didn't always win. Around 3 p.m, a nurse came to the chapel looking for us. She was an older woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Something about her reminded me of the church ladies I'd grown up with, the ones who knew that sometimes the most important ministry happened in quiet moments of human connection. "Are you Evangeline Rosemary?" she asked gently. "Yes," I said, my heart immediately jumping to the worst possible conclusion. "Is Thaddeus?" "He is stable," she said quickly, and I felt my legs go weak with relief. "But I wanted to talk to you about something. I am Nancy Patterson, and I've been taking care of your son since he arrived." Cordelia and I exchanged glances. This woman seemed different from the other hospital staff we'd encountered. Warmer somehow, more willing to bend the rigid rules that had kept me from my son's bedside. "I understand there has been some confusion about visiting privileges," Nancy continued, sitting down in the pew across from us. "And I want you to know that while I have to follow hospital policy, there might be times when the intensive care unit gets busy, when people come and go without being closely monitored." She wasn't exactly saying I could sneak in to see Thaddeus, but she wasn't not saying it either. It was the kind of careful non-suggestion that allowed us both to maintain plausible deniability while acknowledging that sometimes love mattered more than paperwork. Hypothetically speaking, Nancy continued, if someone were to find themselves on the 7th floor around shift change at 7 p.m., when the hallways tend to be more crowded and the staff is focused on patient handoffs, they might be able to spend a few quiet minutes in room 712 before anyone noticed they weren't supposed to be there. My eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "Thank you," I whispered. "You don't know how much this means to me." "Actually, I do," Nancy said, her own eyes growing misty. "I have 3 children of my own, and I can't imagine anything that would keep me from their bedside if they needed me. Sometimes the rules need to be bent in service of something higher." She stood to leave, then turned back with one final piece of information. "Mrs. Rosemary, I want you to know that your son is fighting hard. His body is broken, but his vital signs suggest he's not ready to give up. Whatever differences you two have had, whatever walls have been built between you, love has a way of reaching through even the deepest unconsciousness. Don't underestimate the power of a mother as voice." After Nancy left, Cordelia and I sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Finally, she shook her head in amazement. "God works in mysterious ways," she said softly. "Yes, he does," I agreed. "And sometimes he works through nurses who know that love is more important than liability." We spent the next few hours in the hospital cafeteria, picking at sandwiches we couldn't really taste and watching the clock crawl toward 7 p.m. I was nervous in a way I'd never been before, like I was preparing for the most important conversation of my life with someone who couldn't hear me speak. What would I say to Thaddeus when I saw him? How do you talk to your unconscious child about forgiveness and love when the last words between you were filled with anger and rejection? How do you pour out your heart to someone who might never wake up to hear your voice? At 6:45, we took the elevator to the 7th floor. The intensive care unit was exactly as intimidating as I'd imagined. All beeping machines and urgent whispers and the kind of controlled chaos that meant people were fighting for their lives behind every door. Cordelia waited in a small alcove near the elevators while I gathered my courage and approached room 712. Nancy had been right about shift change. The hallway was busy with nurses reviewing charts and sharing information about their patients. No one paid attention to the gray-haired woman in the simple dress who slipped quietly through the door of room 712. Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw inside that room. My son, my strong, successful, larger-than-life son, looked like a broken child lying in that hospital bed. His face was swollen and bruised. His left arm was in a cast, and there were tubes and wires connecting him to machines that monitored every breath, every heartbeat. The Thaddeus who had stood in my living room just 2 days earlier, so confident and cruel and absolutely certain of his own importance, was gone. In his place was this fragile, vulnerable human being who looked younger than his 34 years. I pulled a chair close to his bedside and sat down, not trusting my legs to hold me up. For several minutes, I just watched him breathe, grateful for every rise and fall of his chest, thankful for every beep of the monitor that proved his heart was still beating. "Hello, baby," I whispered, and my voice broke on the words. "Mama Chess here." I don't know if unconscious people can hear the voices of their loved ones, but I'd always believed they could. So I talked to him. I told him about the birthday dinner he'd missed, about the cake I'd baked with such hope, about the flowers from my garden that had wilted while I waited for him to come home. "I want you to know," I said, reaching out to touch his uninjured hand, "that I forgive you for everything that happened the other night. I forgive you for the harsh words, for trying to take away my house, for calling me a burden. I forgive you because you're my son, and because love doesn't stop just because someone hurts us." His hand was warm under mine, and for a moment I thought I felt his fingers twitch. But when I looked at his face, his eyes remained closed, his expression unchanged. "I've been thinking about what you said," I continued, "about how I held you back, about how I made you feel guilty for succeeding. And maybe there is some truth in that. Maybe I did hold on too tight when I should have let go. Maybe I did make my love feel like a burden instead of a gift." The words were hard to say, but they felt important somehow. If this was my only chance to speak to my son, if he never woke up to hear my voice again, I wanted him to know that I understood his perspective, even if I didn't agree with his methods. "But baby," I said, tears streaming down my face now, "success without love is just emptiness. Money without family is just numbers on a bank statement. And if you have to throw away everyone who helped you get where you are, then where you are isn't worth being." I sat with him for nearly an hour, talking about everything and nothing. I told him about Cordelia, his kindness, about Nancy, his compassion, about the community of people who were praying for his recovery. I told him about the letters I'd saved from his college years, about the pictures I kept on my mantle, about all the ways I was still proud of him despite everything that had happened between us. "If you can hear me," I said finally, "I need you to know that you were not fighting this battle alone. Your mama is here, and I am not going anywhere. No matter what you said, no matter how much you think you don't need me, I am here because this is what love looks like. Love doesn't give up. Love doesn't walk away. Love stays." I was preparing to leave when something incredible happened. Thaddeus' eyes fluttered open. For a moment, we just stared at each other. His gaze was unfocused and confused, and I could see him trying to process where he was and why he was there. Then his eyes found mine, and I watched as recognition slowly dawned in his expression. "Mom." His voice was barely a whisper, rough from the breathing tube that had been removed just hours earlier. "Yes, baby. Mem here," I said, squeezing his hand gently. "You were in the hospital, but you were going to be okay." He tried to sit up and immediately winced in pain. "What happened?" I remember driving and then lights, bright lights coming toward me. "You were in an accident," I explained, keeping my voice calm and soothing. "A drunk driver hit you on Highway 65. You've been unconscious for almost 2 days." Thaddeus looked around the room, taking in the machines and the medical equipment, trying to piece together the events that had led him here. Then his gaze returned to me, and I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen in years. Vulnerability, fear, and underneath it all, a flicker of the little boy who used to run to me when he was scared or hurt. "Mom," he said again, and this time there was wonder in his voice. "You came. After everything I said to you, after how terrible I was, you still came." I felt my heart break open with love and relief. "Of course I came. You're my son. Nothing will ever change that." Tears started flowing down his cheeks, and when he tried to wipe them away, he seemed surprised by his own emotion. "I am so sorry," he whispered. "God, Mom, I am so sorry for everything. The things I said to you, the way I treated you, I don't know what was wrong with me." "Shh," I said, leaning forward to smooth his hair away from his forehead the way I used to when he was small. "You don't need to apologize right now. You need to focus on getting better." "No, I do need to apologize. I need you to understand that none of what I said was true. You were not a burden. You were not something to be ashamed of. You're the best mother anyone could ask for. And I've been so stupid, so blind to what really matters." He was crying harder now, and I could see that the emotional pain was almost worse than his physical injuries. I thought success meant leaving everything behind, cutting ties with anything that reminded me of where I came from. I thought that to be somebody important, I had to pretend that my past didn't matter. "What changed your mind?" I asked gently. Thaddeus closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, they were filled with a clarity that hadn't been there before his accident. Lying in that car, trapped and bleeding and thinking I was going to die, all I could think about was you. Not my business, not my money, not my important clients, just you. I kept thinking about how the last words I'd said to you were so cruel, how I'd hurt the one person who had always loved me unconditionally. He paused, struggling with emotions too big for words. And then I thought about what would happen if I died. Who would come to my funeral? Derek would be there because we were business partners. Maybe a few clients would send flowers, but who would actually mourn me? Who would remember the boy I used to be, not just the man I became? The answer hung in the air between us, unspoken but understood. "Only you," he continued. "Only you would remember that I used to build forts out of couch cushions, and that I cried during sad movies, and that I once wanted to be a firefighter when I grew up. Only you would mourn, not just my death, but the loss of all the love I'd thrown away." I was crying too now, but they were tears of relief and joy rather than sorrow. This was my son speaking, my real son, not the stranger who had stood in my living room 2 nights ago. And I realized something else too, Thaddeus said. Lying there in the dark, waiting for help to come, I understood that everything I'd achieved meant nothing if I had no one to share it with. All my success felt hollow and empty when I thought about dying alone, disconnected from the people who actually knew and loved me. He squeezed my hand with surprising strength. Mom, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Is it too late? Have I damaged our relationship beyond repair, or is there a chance you could forgive me and let me try to be your son again? I stared at him through my tears, amazed by the transformation I was witnessing. The arrogant, ashamed man who had rejected me was gone, replaced by someone who understood that love was more valuable than any business deal, that family was more important than social status. Baby, I said, my voice thick with emotion, I forgave you before you even asked. Sitting in the chapel downstairs, waiting to find out if you were going to live or die, I made a choice to forgive you whether you wanted my forgiveness or not. Not because you deserved it, but because carrying anger and resentment was poisoning my own heart. Thaddeus looked stunned. You forgave me while I was unconscious? While you didn't even know if I'd ever wake up to apologize? That's what real forgiveness is, I explained. It's not something you earn through good behavior or sincere apologies. It is a gift that the forgiver gives to themselves as much as to the person who hurt them. I forgave you because holding on to anger was killing me, and because I wanted to love you freely instead of being trapped by bitterness. We talked for another 20 minutes before Nancy appeared in the doorway with a knowing smile. I hate to interrupt, she said, but visiting hours are officially over and Mr. Collins has been asking about unauthorized visitors in the ICU. Thaddeus A.S. expression immediately hardened. Derek can go to hell. This is my mother, and if he has a problem with her being here, he can find himself a new business partner. Nancy and I exchanged surprised glances. The change in Thaddeus was remarkable, and apparently it extended beyond just our relationship. Actually, Nancy said, there has been a development regarding Mr. Collins. It seems that while you were unconscious, he took some liberties with your business accounts. The hospital AS financial department noticed some irregularities when he tried to authorize certain treatments, and when they investigated, they discovered that he'd been embezzling money from your company for months. Thaddeus sat up straighter, wincing with the effort. What? The police arrested him about an hour ago, Nancy continued. Apparently, he'd been planning to blame the missing money on your medical expenses, but he got careless and tried to access accounts he wasn't authorized for. They've frozen your business assets pending investigation, but the good news is that most of your personal accounts weren't affected. The irony was almost overwhelming. The man Thaddeus had trusted more than his own mother, the man he'd given control over his medical decisions, had been stealing from him while I was being excluded from his life for being allegedly self-serving. Mom, Thaddeus said, turning to me with an expression of profound gratitude, would you be willing to stay? Not just for tonight, but until I am well enough to leave. I know I have no right to ask after everything that happened, but I don't want to face this alone. Of course I'll stay, I said without hesitation. As long as you need me, I'll be here. And I was. I stayed at Thaddeus's bedside for the next 2 weeks while he recovered from his injuries. We talked about everything we should have discussed years earlier. He told me about the pressure he'd felt to succeed, about the loneliness that came with cutting ties to his past, about the way success had isolated him from genuine human connection. I told him about the pride I'd always felt in his achievements, about how much I'd missed him during the years when he'd pulled away, about the way love had sustained me even when our relationship seemed broken beyond repair. Slowly, carefully, we began to rebuild what had been damaged. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight. There were moments when old patterns of hurt and defensiveness surfaced. There were conversations that ended in tears and misunderstandings that required patience to resolve. But what we built this time was stronger than what we had before because it was based on honest communication rather than assumptions, on mutual respect rather than guilt and obligation. Thaddeus learned to appreciate his background instead of being ashamed of it, and I learned to love him without trying to control or manipulate his choices. The most remarkable change, though, was in Thaddeus Mbs' approach to success itself. His near-death experience had fundamentally altered his priorities. When he was released from the hospital and returned to his business, he made dramatic changes to how he operated. He started a foundation that provided scholarships for children from low-income families, remembering his own struggles to afford college. He moved his company's headquarters back to Millbrook, bringing good-paying jobs to our small town and investing in the community that had shaped him. And he made sure that his employees had the kind of work-life balance that allowed them to prioritize family relationships alongside professional achievement. But the most important change was in our relationship. Thaddeus called me every day, not out of obligation, but because he genuinely wanted to hear my voice. He visited every weekend, bringing groceries and helping with household repairs, and simply spending time together. And when he introduced me to his clients and business associates, he did so with pride, telling them about the sacrifices I'd made to give him opportunities and the lessons I'd taught him about hard work and perseverance. 6 months after the accident, Thaddeus surprised me by asking if I'd consider moving into the guest house behind his property in Louisville. He'd renovated it specifically for me, creating a space that felt like home while allowing us to be close enough for daily interaction. "I am not asking because I think I'd take care of yourself," he explained. "And I am not asking because I feel guilty about what happened between us. I am asking because I've learned that life is too short to waste time being apart from the people you love." I moved to Louisville that fall, bringing with me the furniture and mementos that made the guest house feel like home. But I kept the house on Maple Street too, because it held too many precious memories to let go, and because Millbrook would always be the place where my heart felt most at peace. Living near Thaddeus allowed us to develop the kind of adult relationship I'd always dreamed of having with him. We shared meals several times a week, took walks together in the evenings, and had the kinds of deep conversations that had been impossible when pride and hurt stood between us. He sought my advice on business decisions, not because he had to, but because he valued my perspective. I offered opinions when asked, and kept them to myself when not, respecting the boundaries that allowed our relationship to flourish. Most importantly, we both learned the difference between love that binds and love that frees. I learned to love Thaddeus without needing to be needed, without requiring his success to validate my sacrifices. And he learned to love me without shame, without seeing my presence in his life as a limitation on his possibilities. The accident that had nearly taken my son away from me forever became the catalyst for the most honest, healthy relationship we'd ever shared. The 24 hours that began with rejection and heartbreak ended with reconciliation and renewed hope. But perhaps the most profound lesson I learned during that terrible and wonderful time was about the nature of forgiveness itself. I'd always thought forgiveness was something you gave to someone who had earned it through repentance and changed behavior. But sitting in that hospital chapel, facing the possibility that my son might die without ever knowing he was forgiven, I discovered that true forgiveness is a gift you give to yourself. Forgiving Thaddeus didn't excuse his cruelty or minimize the pain he caused me. It didn't erase the memory of harsh words or undo the damage to my heart. What it did was free me from the prison of resentment and anger that threatened to consume me. It allowed me to love him fully again, without conditions or requirements, and that love became the foundation for everything beautiful that followed. Today, 3 years after that terrible birthday confrontation and the accident that changed everything, Thaddeus and I have a relationship that's deeper and more authentic than anything we shared when he was growing up. We've learned to see each other as complete human beings rather than just mother and son, to appreciate each other, Isa's strengths, and accept each other, Isa's flaws. He's married now to a wonderful woman named Sarah who understands the importance of family and who has embraced me as her own mother. They're expecting their first child next spring, and Thaddeus has asked me to help them choose names that honor both their future and their past. When people ask me how I survived having my heart broken by my own child, how I found the strength to forgive someone who had wounded me so deeply, I tell them about that night in the hospital chapel when I realized that forgiveness wasn't about Thaddeus at all. It was about me choosing love over bitterness, hope over despair, faith over fear. I tell them that forgiveness is the most selfish thing you can do because it benefits the forgiver more than the forgiven. Holding on to anger and resentment is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick. Forgiveness is the antidote that heals your own heart and sets you free to love again. And I tell them that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing that ever happened to you. Not because the pain wasn't real or the hurt wasn't valid, but because it forces you to discover strength you didn't know you had and grace you didn't know you were capable of extending. If you're watching this story and you're carrying pain from someone who has hurt you, someone you love who has rejected or wounded or disappointed you, I want you to know that forgiveness is possible. Not easy, but possible. It starts with a choice, a decision to stop letting someone else's actions determine your emotional well-being. It doesn't happen all at once, and it doesn't mean you have to reconcile with the person who hurt you or pretend that what they did was acceptable. What it means is that you refuse to let their choices poison your heart any longer. The road to forgiveness is long and difficult, and you'll probably have to choose it over and over again. But at the end of that road is freedom, peace, and the possibility of love that is stronger than any hurt that has been inflicted upon it. My name is Evangeline Rosemary, and this has been my story of how the worst day of my life became the first day of the rest of my life. A story of forgiveness, reconciliation, and the mysterious ways that God can work even in our darkest moments to bring about something beautiful. If this story has touched your heart, if it has reminded you of the power of love and forgiveness in your own life, I hope you'll share it with others who might need to hear these words of hope. And if you have your own story of forgiveness and redemption, I'd love to hear it in the comments below. Until we meet again, remember that no relationship is beyond repair if both people are willing to choose love over pride, understanding over judgment, and forgiveness over resentment. And remember that sometimes the greatest miracles happen not when circumstances change, but when hearts do. God bless you all, and thank you for listening to my story.